Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this panel. Harry, thank you so much for this great introduction. I am indeed Andrew, regular journalist and podcast host at TechEU, and I've got a great panel for you today to discuss the tech news of tomorrow and the way that the tech news coverage is shifting through the years. So since Harry has just introduced the panel for me, we can dive straight in. We've only got 20 minutes and we can start with sort of a lightning round. So question for everyone. In terms of the tech news today, how are you actually looking at the startups that you are considering writing about? What are you looking at? Is it tech? Is it societal impact? Is it actually something else? Let's start from Mimi and go through Heather to Jordan.
Well, I think that's a really difficult question because it really depends on both the startup, but also maybe the news situation all the time. For example, I mean, there are innovation out there, which is great, but you need some kind of hook to actually write about them, right? So it's not always just enough to have a great company as doing something great, but you always need something extra, I think. And that could be anything from a funding round or perhaps something going on in the company that's not good, or something that is good, or something similar that actually other people or the readers can learn something about. That's
so you're looking for a story in a way.
Yeah.
Right. Heather, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with Mimi actually that the story is the most important thing, because otherwise it's a kind of so what. There are these guys, they got together in their garage and they did this. Yes, but what then? I think if there is a growing market, it always helps. If it's a clearly growing market, it's even better. I'm quite nerdy and I quite like it when people give me statistics because it's something that I can back up my argument with. It makes it easier. It helps if you've got a personality to sell the story with, but I don't think it's essential, and not everything comes with that much colour. But colour's always great because it livens up your intro or the rest of what you're going to write about or think about. But I think also, you have to be solid. You have to have a good company. The technology has to work. What it does has got to be clear, because sometimes we're trying to grasp really complex things in a very short space of time. So the better the explanation, for me, that really helps a lot.
Right. So we've got story, we've got data, we've got personality. Jordan, what is it for you then?
It's certainly to answer your question, Andre. We look at startups with discernment. Long overdue is the end of this sort of honeymoon that every startup's a great company, every startup's doing well, and everything that comes out of them is a wonderful product. And we've learned and long known that that's not necessarily true. I think to serve our audiences, rather than to sort of pander and market a lot of these companies, we're in a lot better role as a watchdog. To dig a little bit deeper, ask a few more questions, and make sure that we're getting the story right. Oftentimes it means talking to competitors about what each other are doing. One of my favorite questions, and I'm sure this might come up later, is, who do you see as your most advanced competitor, right? And you often are able to triangulate a bit better about who's doing what. And former employees, I'll just say, they offer up plenty of dirt on what's going in inside a former entity. I will say oftentimes it's great things. There's a lot of innovation, not just in the technology itself, but how companies are performing, how they measure their success, and how they organize themselves, that we also find interesting, that we'll certainly report on. And then just to place a common thread on what we cover, I did mention the watchdog label. Certainly that does lead to discernment as it relates to any company, not just startups. But we're certainly after adding value, right? And our audience is pretty broad, so that's going to be mostly consumer facing when it comes to the startup space.
Yeah, understood. So yeah, I do understand the idea of the watchdog, but I kind of feel that lately it has certainly been the case for people who write about sort of big tech, about the Facebooks and Amazons and Googles of this world. But is it actually becoming so for startups? Mimi, you're writing about startups a lot for Sifted. Do you feel like you're becoming a watchdog and you're becoming more critical over the years?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that, I mean, because I've been writing about maybe tech startups now for 6 years or so, and I mean, it's not that long in the whole lapse of things. But I mean, I think that the longer you follow certain startups, you will also then be able to analyze them better, and then be able to do, I mean, to actually write something that means something more than actually as, oh, so this company is expanding to a new country, and well, when they are failing, they're not actually going to contact you as a journalist, right?
Not at all.
So then you need to have people to actually, tell you, because obviously, I mean, I think it's really difficult as a journalist. We can't know everything that goes on everywhere, and we are almost in the hands and the arms or in the laps of people who actually want to share that information with us so we can do our jobs, because otherwise we'll be all this, as Jordan said, that we're just going to be like this nice like PR agency for startups, and we don't want to do that, obviously.
So just recently you gave this very nice beating to Oatley, the milk company. So what's the rationale, let's say, of making this sort of critical approach? What's the rationale of these sort of pieces? What do you want to achieve?
I think that with Oatley, it was an interesting piece because I had written about them before, and I knew their story, how they have been branding themselves, and how they've been perceived in Sweden over time. And then because of this, what happened with Blackstone, for people who knows about this story, I mean, that meant that I could put it in perspective, that with new owners from 2016 and new owners now, 2019, 2020, I mean, the stories are just repeating themselves. And
Right.
I think that it's just about understanding that nothing happens in some kind of vacuum, right? So you have to just go back and look at history for a company to see why things are happening to it.
Right. Yeah, and for our audience, if you have not read this piece, do go ahead to sifted.eu and just search for Oatley, and you will see what Mimi has written. Now, Heather, how about yourself? You, as like a contributor, you have much more, I suppose, freedom in choosing which startups you are actually writing about. So, how critical are you when looking at them?
I think you should probably ask the people who try and sell me an idea. It is really hard. I think, as Mimi says, it's hard because, especially if something's young and new, there's really very little to go on. And I mean, that's what's fun about writing about startups, covering startups. That's also what's very challenging. And I think I would say word of mouth can be quite important, but that maybe, for me, I find that works better here in the Nordics, where a lot of people tend to know other people, they tend to know what they're doing. I mean, very often if I'm going to go and meet someone, I'll say to a friend or a neighbor, I'm going to go and talk to so-and-so, and they might know of them. I think where you have quite an interconnected startup community, that's more likely to happen. And also here, I think you get a lot of people involved who've made a bigger company, who then put something back in. Either they've stepped away from their own company and they're doing something else, they're investing, or they're running a foundation encouraging startups. So I think because of that, I would normally have quite often people I can go to and say, you know, so-and-so, or have you seen this thing where blah, blah. And quite often you get a bit of a feedback, but sometimes it's just when it's blindingly obvious idea. And when you start looking around, you find actually there aren't that many other people doing it, or they are doing it, but they're not doing it very well. So maybe these guys have an edge. Or sometimes it just happens randomly, you know, and you get sent something about a company, and then you happen to speak to a 19-year-old who says, oh yeah, that's a really great search engine, and it's great because you're planting trees, and you think, story, it costs you, okay, it goes. I think it is difficult because there is so little real information, and often people think just to send you a list of a couple of series rounds of funding is information. Well, it's not. I tend to ask quite specific questions, how many users, how many this, how many that, and I push really for as much as I can get in terms of hard data. Much harder in the early days, obviously, when things are still under development.
Right. Another question is on Jordan. Do you actually feel that it's becoming, let's say, more important, the tech coverage? Do you think it's becoming more important for the audience that you're working for?
Yeah, certainly. Look, a lot of where people are moving in terms of jobs is in the tech sector. So just on an employment basis, people are using more technology, right? Just go back 100 years, compare it to today, and technology's in our hands, like literally right now, and figuratively, actually literally and physically all around us. So certainly it's a bigger piece of a pie. If you will, though, just speaking of pushing, I do want to go back to Mimi's point, because it's just so important about the trend towards discernment, as I call it. And where I'll push back is actually on your use of the word beating, Andre. If you read the piece on Sifted, we covered the Oatley story too in a nutshell. No pun intended. They converted sort of ownership stakes changed, and their new owners are, let's say, less than scrupulous, and really she was just reporting the facts, right? And that's really ultimately our job as journalists, is to get the facts, marshal facts in the hands of our audiences, and so that they can make better decisions, right, about what they do. And so back to your question, as it relates to tech sphere of influence, it's certainly grown. Certainly in a more physically disconnected world. I don't have to remind everyone that we're in a pandemic and we rely on these things. So just by that pulling that thread more, right? If there's a security issue, a safety issue, an issue with certain leadership, ownership, as in the case with Oatley, of a brand, and that's incongruent with the value systems of some of our audience, for example, they'll want to know that, and they'll come to expect that from us, to report it, probably just as they did at Sifted. And that's probably the impetus, if I were to guess, for the same reason, is why they cover the story and not a different one.
Right. Mimi, what do you think? So you're working for a bit of a different audience. You're working specifically for entrepreneurs and people within the ecosystem. So how the importance of your work do you think changes for these people?
Well, I think at least for us, it's becoming more competitive since tech journalism overall is becoming much more popular, even in mainstream media as well. So we are kind of struggling to get the good interviews sometimes, because in the beginning it's really easy, right? So startups always tend to go to tech media, but then when they grow and are the size of Klarna or Spotify or something else, they dump us. They go to the bigger ones like Reuters or Bloomberg or whatever, and all the kind of the know-how that we have about these companies, it's used because we can still write analysis, obviously, but it makes it much more difficult for us to do our job really well. But obviously, of course, that's, as we're talking about, the startups actually, when they turn scale ups and so on, I mean, it's easy for us to analyze them because we know them, they have the data and everything. But then they don't want us to analyze them because we are going to be the most critical about these companies as well, and when they are doing something wrong. So therefore, they also choose mainstream because it's going to be easier to also get their point across, I suppose. But then, I mean, for our readers, obviously, I mean, I don't know, what was the question again? Did I lose you there?
No, we're talking about importance. So basically, what do you think the importance of this tech coverage for the audience of entrepreneurs and people who are already within the ecosystem as compared to the wider audience that, for example, Jordan has?
Yeah, okay. So I think startups really want to be seen at Sifted or elsewhere to be able to both go out and find new recruits to recruit people. I think that's one of the key whys they come to us. But then obviously, because it's not actually about finding customers as much. I mean, maybe they're business to business, but then, I mean, that's when you go to your local paper or your kind of mainstream media to find out how you can get in there, I think. But to get to maybe also to be seen by investors, because there are lots of investors that read Sifted, and therefore people want to be seen there. I mean, obviously to get more money.
Heather, another question. How often do you actually write about big tech companies, and do you think your approach to them is very different from what it would be for startups?
That's a good question. I don't tend to write so much about big tech companies because I'm in a position where a lot of the time I can choose what I decide is a story. And I also think that when you get really big, quite often you are big in a very specific way. So if you take Tesla, which is a tech company, that gets a lot of coverage in automotive, which is not my batch. It depends what aspect you're looking at. I think the principles are the same, but I think in a really big company, you get other issues coming in. If you just to take the Tesla example, you have management issues at Tesla. You have collective bargaining, lack of collective bargaining issues. You have governance issues, but you have a really big head start in a particular market, and you're doing something in a very different way to other electric car manufacturers. So it's kind of a different story. I think at the beginning, the big question is, could this be a big tech company of tomorrow? Everyone is looking for the Teslas of tomorrow. And I sometimes see, I suppose, my readers as wanting to know about the Teslas of tomorrow. Do you see something in this company, that startup, that has the potential to become one of those? But I don't think, I've written about both big and small companies, and I've invested in both. And I don't really think that there's much difference in some ways as to your approach as a journalist when you're examining the story critically. And as the others have said, I think quite often the best you can do is put the information in front of the readers and marshal your facts together in a compelling way. And then really it is the readers who are going to decide, I want to go on following this. I'm going to look this up. I'm going to connect to it. I'm going to follow them. You're raising the awareness perhaps, but you can't know everything. And I think it's very dangerous to try and pretend that you do, because that's just bullshit. People have to make up their own views.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
If you can be balanced about it, then I think you make it easy.
Right. Yeah, but it's a good position. It's a good point. But I have to say that I would be the first to admit that I think I tend to cut some more slack to early stage startups compared to later stage startups when I write about them. So Mimi, Jordan, is it the same for you, or is it not anymore?
Well,
sorry. I should say one name. Jordan, go ahead.
Sure, well, picking up, listening intently to Heather, there's a lot of bullshit, and you wanna avoid it, certainly. And whether that comes from big cap tech companies, really any brand from our point of view, or a smaller company, that's certainly true, and they certainly will feed you plenty of lines, and you have to look at that with some skepticism. Slack. Well, it depends. It's a good question to unpack, right? So earlier, both Heather and Mimi unpacked how they, would effectively initiate coverage, and that's the word that we use for a company that's sort of new to our coverage universe. And a lot of times those articles are a little bit more, introductory, right? The who, what, where, when, and how. And naturally that's going to occur for earlier stage companies. And therefore, just by the nature of the article itself, that first piece or two is typically going to be a little more, lenient only because naturally it's at a higher level, right? And covers a lot more of the basics, Andre. Certainly as you tile the floor later, if there's something crooked, it's going to come up. If you've covered a company or let's say broadly an organization or a brand more than a few times, usually a lot's happened, or maybe should I say a lot's always happening in all these companies, especially as they grow. Some good and some bad. Either way, a lot of those facts are something that we want to again, to use the word marshal, for it if we find that it's important, or we find that our audience wants to hear about it. So I think it's somewhat of a natural progression. And let's say a 2-person company doing like a sort of like a vegan dough sales, and they just got into Costco. They're going to have a lot less going on than some, let's just not name names here, but a certain battery company that has a very active CEO on Twitter, with thousands and thousands of employees. Those are two very different beasts, and oftentimes, because of the nature of the beast, the coverage is going to be totally different.
I could add something to that as well, because I think that the small companies, the introductory articles that you're talking about, Jordan, I think that's also, unfortunately, in some way, unfortunately, those are going to die, because the tech scene is growing so immensely. So we won't have time to actually look into the smallest ones. We will start actually covering them at a much later stage. I remember when people could contact me with a funding round on about like 100,000 euros. And now they wouldn't even be mentioned until they just do at least 4 or 5 million euros almost. It's a completely different landscape today than it was just 5 years ago. So yes.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, the entry barrier into the media in terms of funding and all. Let's take a quick break and take a question from the audience. The question is, do you have a favorite topic within tech and startups? Let's do it from Heather through Mimi to Jordan.
I like green tech.
Green tech there, Mimi?
Yeah, I love all tech, but I'm a health tech correspondent, so I should say I like health tech.
What a time to be a health tech reporter.
Definitely. It's new FinTech, I've heard.
Jordan, you're an editor, an executive editor. You're a lot on the business side, but still, when you have to write, if you have to write, what's the topic of choice for you?
Oh, writing is a luxury for me. Love to do it. Maybe love editing more. But if you know my background with 3D printed pizza made by robots for astronauts, it's certainly food tech. Exciting space, probably will be for the while. And I like to think of it though as a subset of sort of health tech anyway.
Right. Yeah, I can add my own answer here. When I'm at liberty to choose what I'm writing about, I really like assistive tech. So whatever is used for people with all sorts of disabilities, from prosthetics to e-readers for Braille books. So this is something I'm always interested in hearing about. Now, I also wanted to pick on one of the points that was mentioned in our preliminary call earlier this week, and it is that a lot of people, it's like the barrier of entry into tech journalism is actually lower than ever. So you can become a tech journalist just by sending your own, let's say, newsletter, register on Substack, and so on. So do you think this is actually part of the tech news of tomorrow, coming back to our panel name? Do you think we're going to see more of those independent reporting stories coming from individuals rather than media outlets? Mimi, what do you think?
Well, I would like to say no, because to having the journalism degree and everything is important to have that kind of objectivity. But on the other hand, the newsletters being sent out about the Nordic tech scene by people who are not journalists, but are investors or just really interested in the tech scene. I think those are great, and I think that the experience that they have that I don't have is obviously adding something to the discussion, and I think that's really important, and I hope to see more of that in the future.
Right. Heather, do you read a lot of newsletters? What do you think about them?
I read what I'm interested in. I mean, how do you decide what you're reading? You know, it's either you're following something and you find something new, or maybe you get sent something and you think it's interesting, or you're looking someone up and then you see they've written something on something. I mean, my mind doesn't tend to discriminate very much. It's the information is where whatever it is, and I think in the same way anyone can put the views and information out there. And I think, you know, one of the great things about now is we can tap into what other people have said or written without having to know them, without having to ask someone where they are. I suppose that also brings another thing, which is, do you necessarily know whether what someone else has written about is correct? Is it missing certain things out that you don't know about? I think I love having more information and having it more widely available. But I think you have to remember that one of the skills everybody needs today is distilling a lot of information that comes at you from different directions that may not have been edited. It may come from someone with a particular perspective. It's important to sort of still be critical, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordan, do you think these independent news sources are going to be part of the tomorrow's landscape?
Well, how you define it, especially categorically broadly, I think you do. Let's just throw some names in there. Newsletter, Substack, Medium, blog post, pamphlets. There's a lot of ways to, tweets even, right? Tweets have news in them often.
Oh yeah.
140 characters. I think there may be 2 points I'd like to make. The first one would be intent. The intent of the writing of the literature. Right. Oftentimes, I think this is a pretty innocuous example of a VC or private equity firm. They issue out some news or a listicle in an email newsletter. There's probably a lot of nuggets in there. Certainly, they want to inform at least some of their readership, but oftentimes there's a marketing angle to it, which is very common thread with really any private enterprise. It's not necessarily a news outlet. And so back to intent, often news organizations really are just after sharing with their audience something particular, again, so that their audience benefits, that their audience, clicks on ads or subscribes, which is more and more common, or goes to their events, virtual or otherwise, right? So they're literally and ultimately serving their audience, whereas other organizations are typically marketing, and that's the intent and sort of motive behind it. The other is kind of a combination of form and function. What it comes down to is oversight. To paraphrase Mimi, I was listening earlier, she used the word, trust or authenticity. And just broadly, one function of news media is there's editorial oversight. So I'm an editor. I more or less sit on the business side as an executive editor. But at Sifted, at Forbes, certainly, and at Grip Daily, there's a layer of editors who are literally fact checking, not just grammatically and sort of getting the writing right, so it's prose and well written. But also to make sure that whatever is being fed to us isn't bullshit. Again, to borrow from Heather's term from earlier, and well, that relates to it's often very different from these marketing incentives that exist, and you want to cut through that noise and make sure it gets sort of the audience. So just to wrap that up quickly, I think the audiences will always be there for news organizations. People always certainly fall prey to less or inauthentic quote news unquote that's out there, Andre. But certainly there's a home for both of them as we see today, and that'll evolve.
Right, absolutely. And this is all that we have time for today in this panel. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks a lot to our audience. Thanks a lot to our great panelists, Mimi Billing of Sifted, Heather Farnborough, freelance journalist and senior contributor to Forbes, and Jordan French, executive editor at Grit Daily. If you've got any more questions for us, you can take it to Twitter. Just look for our names, find us on Twitter, and let's talk further. Now, thanks a lot for the TechBBQ organization. And now it is over to you guys.